July 6, 1944, deep in the violent heart of the European Air War, where the sky itself seemed to tremble under the weight of history. The Western Front had become a crucible of steel and fire, a place where decisions made in seconds reshaped the fate of nations. Above the cold, broken landscape of Germany, a storm was gathering, one the Allied pilots could feel in their bones long before they saw it. Rumors whispered across airfields spoke of a machine that defied the rules of the sky, a German creation with swept lines, screaming engines, and a speed that seemed almost inhuman. The Me-262, the jet that made even veteran pilots feel suddenly young, unprepared, and mortal. Into this sky of fear and uncertainty, a single American fighter thundered forward, a P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine mocked for its weight, dismissed as a flying sledgehammer, and affectionately cursed by the very men whose lives depended on it. They called it the Jug, a nickname that captured its shape, its stubbornness, and the quiet promise buried within its armor. It would take punishment that would rip lesser fighters apart. And on this day, it carried a pilot who would soon be forced into a choice no training manual prepared him for. He would attempt the impossible, outrun a German jet that could slice the air at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. The moment opens not with triumph, but with dread. The pilot sees a flicker in the distance, a thin silver shape almost too fast for the eye to follow. The bombers ahead of him, slow, vulnerable, and vital, are already in danger. What the pilot feels is not heroism, but the crushing responsibility borne by every fighter escort. He knows the Thunderbolt was never designed to chase a jet. Its bulk was born of engineering compromises, battlefield pressures, and American industrial philosophy. But war has a way of stripping away the theoretical and exposing the truth of a machine. What fascinates, even now, is the contrast that begins to form. An aircraft viewed as outdated facing an enemy seemingly decades ahead of its time. The Jug, with its thick wings and roaring radial engine, was an artifact from a different era, a brute force answer to a question the war kept rewriting. And yet, hidden inside its rugged frame were secrets, traits born from over-engineering, from cautious design choices, from a determination to build something that could absorb punishment and still claw its way home. As the German jet angles toward the bombers, the pilot feels that moment of impossible hesitation, the space between fear and action where a man's instincts battle his doubts. From the ground, the sky looks vast, almost serene. Up here, it feels claustrophobic, like a tightening vise formed of velocity, altitude, and limited options. He knows the Thunderbolt cannot out-accelerate the Me-262. It cannot turn with it. It cannot chase it in level flight. The only card left in his hand is gravity, a weapon that few pilots ever dared to use at its full potential. In that suspended heartbeat of decision, he rolls the Jug over and begins a dive so steep, so violent, that even the airframe seems to protest. There is no guarantee the wings will hold, no guarantee the control surfaces will respond, no guarantee he will survive the descent. But the sky has no patience for guarantees. The moment demands action, and the pilot commits to the kind of plunge that separates the remembered from the lost. What lies ahead of him is not just a chase. It is a collision of engineering cultures, a duel between what the Germans believed was invincible and what the Americans believed was good enough. It is a confrontation that will push both pilot and aircraft into realms no designer fully anticipated. A place where metal distorts, air thickens, and the line between speed and destruction becomes almost indistinguishable. And yet, to understand how that moment became possible, how a supposedly slow American fighter could hurtle through the sky with the speed of a falling meteor, we must step backward, beyond the battlefield, into the very origins of the Thunderbolt itself, where hidden engineering decisions quietly prepared the Jug for a destiny no one saw coming. To understand how a machine as broad-shouldered and unrefined as the P-47 Thunderbolt could one day challenge the physics of pursuit, we must return to its birth, a moment not of glory, but of skepticism. Before it became a legend, the Jug was a problem. Too heavy, too complex, too ambitious, and too unlike anything that had flown before it. It emerged in the early shadows of the war from the drafting tables of Republic Aviation, where engineers wrestled with a question that few dared ask openly. What if American pilots needed a fighter that could survive the worst-case scenario, not just win the best one? The Thunderbolt was built around an engine so colossal it looked almost comical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a power plant that roared rather than hummed, spewing out horsepower with a kind of controlled violence. But the true secret buried inside the Jug's frame was not the engine itself. It was the decision to pair it with one of the war's most intricate turbo supercharger systems, a labyrinth of ducts, pipes, and temperature regulators stretching through the belly of the aircraft. Even its supporters admitted it was overkill. What no one realized was that this overkill would later become the weapon that let the P-47 do the impossible. When the prototype first rolled out, many commanders doubted it. The aircraft was huge, so large that from a distance, early observers mistook it for a light bomber. Its wings were thick, its landing gear long and awkward, and its silhouette lacked the sleek, predatory lines that defined the fighters of Britain and Germany. The Spitfire danced. The Bf-109 sliced. The P-47 simply existed, like a hammer waiting for a hand strong enough to swing it. Many pilots joked that if you ran out of ammunition, you could always ram the enemy with the airframe itself, since nothing short of an artillery shell seemed capable of damaging it. Yet beneath that blunt exterior lived a design philosophy almost prophetic in its foresight. American engineers knew that the European skies demanded altitude. German fighters often struck from above, diving onto bombers with lethal control. To survive, U.S. airmen needed a machine that could climb high, keep its engine breathing in thin air, and still deliver crushing power. And so the Thunderbolt became a paradox, a fighter that was slow to climb but unstoppable once it reached its hunting ground. A machine with wings too thick for elegance but perfect for stability at punishing speeds. An aircraft whose weight was a liability at low altitude, yet a hidden advantage in steep dives where lighter aircraft trembled. Early missions tested these contradictions. Pilots learned quickly that the Jug was not a knife. It was a wrecking ball. It could not turn as tightly as its rivals, nor accelerate with the snap of a lightweight interceptor. But it could dive with a force that shocked even its creators. When pushed into a steep descent, the P-47's mass transformed into something primal, momentum that multiplied with every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. The airframe groaned, the wings flexed, and the controls stiffened, but the aircraft held together. In those first accidental dives, pilots began to glimpse something extraordinary. A machine that, under the right conditions, could reach speeds theoretical charts had never predicted. And yet, despite these revelations, the myth persisted that the P-47 was outdated, a lumbering relic among faster, cleaner designs. The irony is that the very qualities engineers were criticized for, its weight, its bulk, its sturdy internal framework, were the same traits that would one day let a pilot push the Jug into a realm of velocity normally reserved for the enemy's breakthrough jets. This growing awareness spread quietly through squadrons. Mechanics spoke of the aircraft almost as if it had moods. Tough one day, forgiving the next, always hiding reserves of strength. Test pilots returned from flights shaking their heads, muttering that the Thunderbolt could take more punishment than any rational design should survive. There was something unfinished, something waiting to be discovered, tucked deep within its character. And so, while commanders debated its role and strategists questioned its feasibility, the P-47 matured in the hands of men who learned to trust it in spite of its contradictions. They began to sense that the Jug's limitations were simply uncharted edges, boundaries not yet tested, not yet understood, not yet pushed far enough. But machines do not unlock their deepest abilities in training flights or engineering reports. They reveal themselves under pressure, under fire, when a pilot has no choice but to gamble. And that moment was approaching. A moment when the Thunderbolt would be forced beyond theory, beyond safety, and beyond every caution its designers ever wrote in their manuals. The stage was being set. The pilots were changing, the enemy was evolving, and soon one man would discover that the Jug he flew was far more than a misunderstood brute. It was a sleeping predator, waiting for the right pilot and the right crisis to awaken its true speed. And that crisis would arrive in the form of a German jet slicing into bomber formations, demanding a response that no American pilot had ever attempted. The man at the center of this story did not see himself as a hero, nor as the kind of figure whose actions would someday be replayed in documentaries or written into aviation lore. He was a fighter pilot in the European theater. Young enough to still feel invincible, old enough to know that invincibility was a myth the war crushed quickly. His flight jacket carried the usual marks of service: grease stains from long nights in hangars, scuffed leather from rushed scrambles, and a quiet scent of exhaust that clung to every pilot who lived their life inches from a roaring engine. He knew the P-47 intimately, not because he admired it, but because he needed to understand every quirk and flaw of the machine that kept him alive. His squadron had begun to sense the shift long before they saw it. Reports filtered through intelligence briefings of a new German fighter that didn't sound real, a machine faster than anything the Allies possessed. Pilots whispered about it over metal coffee cups, trying to mask the unease. A jet. The word itself carried a charge. It belonged to the future, not the muddy present. As bomber losses rose and sightings increased, the Luftwaffe's new weapon felt less like a rumor and more like a promise of incoming disaster. For a fighter pilot, knowledge was both shield and burden. He studied every scrap of information, engine performance charts, grainy photographs of the Me-262, eyewitness accounts from shaken bomber crews. The German jet could outrun anything, could outclimb anything, could disengage at will. It was a threat you couldn't solve with better gunnery or sharper instincts. It rewrote the rules. And yet, even as fear crept in, something else stirred in him. An understanding built from countless hours wrestling the Thunderbolt through training dives, high-altitude missions, and frantic dogfights. He knew the Jug had limits, but he also knew it had depths that few pilots dared to explore. Every aircraft had a personality, a temperament. The P-47's was stubborn endurance, but buried within that stubbornness was another trait. When pushed downward, when gravity became a weapon, the Jug transformed. He had felt it before. A momentary slip into a speed so sharp and sudden, it felt like the aircraft was tearing a seam in the air. The stick would stiffen, the controls would resist like iron, and the wings would hum with the kind of vibration that made lesser fighters panic. But each time, the Jug held together. It was as if the aircraft possessed a second identity, revealed only when the world was falling away beneath it. Training could only prepare a man for so much. The rest came from instinct, the hardwired part of the pilot's brain that reacted faster than thought, driven by the primal urge to survive and protect. What he did not know was that these instincts would soon be tested in a way no manual, no briefing, no combat report had ever prepared him for. The day of the encounter began like many others. The cold sting of morning air, the metallic echo of mechanics working frantically on engines, the heavy silence of pilots waiting for orders that could send them into life or death chaos. His squadron launched as escort for a bomber group pushing deep into German territory, a mission already filled with tension. Every man in the formation knew the Me-262s were out there. You didn't see them until they wanted to be seen. Hours later, at altitude, that moment arrived. The instant when a tiny dot appeared against the washed-out horizon. The pilot noticed it before the others. A flicker that didn't move like any aircraft he'd ever watched. Too fast, too smooth, too deliberate. A chill ran through him. The German jet was approaching the bombers. He felt the old training rise within him, the checklist of tactical responses. But alongside it came something more visceral, an awareness that none of those responses could match this new threat. He had seconds to decide what kind of pilot he wanted to be. One who held formation and accepted the inevitable, or one who dared to challenge a threat everyone believed was untouchable. In that suspended moment, the sky around him seemed to tighten. The bombers lumbered forward, unaware of how vulnerable they looked. The Me-262, sleek and predatory, tilted toward its prey, and the P-47, heavy and stubborn, idled at the edge of its own potential, waiting for a man to either fear its limits or defy them. He pushed the throttle forward, hard. The jug roared as if startled awake. The pilot felt the familiar weight of the aircraft pressing back against him, reminding him of its size, its gravity, its raw engine power. And then, with a deep breath that steadied the trembling certainty inside him, he rolled the Thunderbolt into a dive steep enough to challenge both man and machine. The air screamed. The cockpit rattled. The altimeter spun downward in a blur. And as the jug plunged, the pilot realized he had crossed into a place where charts ended, where warnings began, and where only instinct and belief in his aircraft could guide him. What happened next would become the kind of moment that war rarely grants, a fragment of raw willpower and mechanical defiance that set the stage for an impossible chase at the edge of human and aerodynamic limits. And that chase waited just ahead, where a falling Thunderbolt would meet the cold, calculated speed of a German jet, hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour. The dive began as a controlled descent, but within seconds it transformed into something far more violent, an act of defiance against the natural order of flight. The Thunderbolt dropped from altitude like a stone hurled by an angry giant, the air around it thickening into a furious roar. The pilot felt gravity crush into his chest, pulling at his limbs, forcing his breath shallow. The sky blurred into streaks of gray and blue as the jug accelerated toward speeds few prop-driven fighters ever dared to reach. In moments like these, altitude wasn't scenery. It was currency, and he was spending it fast. Ahead of him, the Me-262 sliced through the air with mechanical indifference, its twin Jumo engines emitting that unsettling smooth howl that Allied pilots described as the sound of the future. The jet pilot had no idea a Thunderbolt was plummeting toward him from above. Why would he? Every lecture, every briefing, every tactical conclusion told the Luftwaffe that no American fighter could match the 262's velocity. The jet was built to dictate the fight, not to be hunted in it. Inside the jug, the pilot gripped the stick with both hands as the controls began to freeze. Compressibility, the invisible predator of high-speed flight, wrapped around the aircraft like a tightening fist. The nose wanted to bury itself further. The wings trembled with the low, dangerous hum of approaching structural stress. Engineers had warned about this exact moment. Too steep a dive, too much speed, and the airflow would lock the control surfaces, trapping the aircraft in a death plunge. But warnings belong to theory. The pilot belonged to war. He pushed harder, leaning into the force, using every ounce of strength to hold the jug just above the edge of catastrophic descent. The speedometer's trembling needle swept beyond the limits he had ever seen, creeping into a realm where even test pilots hesitated. The Thunderbolt's thick wings, mocked for their drag, now sliced through the compressed air like a war axe breaking a shield. Its massive weight, once the aircraft's greatest flaw, became a weapon, pouring momentum into the dive with ruthless efficiency. The gap between fighter and jet began to shrink, slowly at first, then shockingly fast. The Me-262 pilot, sensing movement in his peripheral vision, banked with a quick defensive roll. At that moment, the German realized something was wrong, something impossible. The silhouette chasing him wasn't a jet. It was a propeller-driven fighter. And worse, it was gaining. He pushed the throttle forward, bringing the jet's engines into full thrust. But jets of that era suffered from one fatal flaw: a moment of lag, a hesitation in power delivery that seemed endless under combat pressure. In that heartbeat of delay, the Thunderbolt closed the distance further. The chase that followed defied logic. A war machine built like a metal anvil was now screaming toward 500 mph, tracking a jet designed to outrun anything with a propeller. The American pilot felt every vibration like a pulse through his bones. The canopy rattled. The wings flexed, bending under forces their designers hoped they would never face. He tasted metal in his mouth, the sign of G-force pushing blood into places it didn't belong. But the jug held, and as he closed within firing range, the impossible became undeniable. The Thunderbolt, the heavy, lumbering, underestimated jug, was outrunning a German jet in a dive. The pilots locked into a deadly equation. The German tried to escape using the 262's superior level flight speed. The American countered with gravity-driven momentum. They dropped lower, faster, past the altitude where bombers lumbered, past the operational ceiling of many fighters, into a part of the sky where mistakes were instantly fatal. Tracer fire erupted first from the Thunderbolt, thin glowing lines carving through the air. The Me-262 jolted in panic, its pilot braking left, then right, attempting to shake the persistent American shadow. But the jug stayed with him, held there by the pilot's sheer will and the aircraft's newfound identity as a predator. For a moment, the entire air war compressed into two machines locked in a duel neither was built for. The jet was the future. The Thunderbolt was the past. Yet the past had discovered that it could break its chains if pushed hard enough. The German realized that continuing the chase meant death. He banked sharply and fled, diving away toward friendly airspace. For the first time, a Me-262 retreated from a P-47. Inside the jug, the pilot pulled back with everything he had, breaking the dive before the ground swallowed him whole. The wings moaned in protest. The control surfaces fought him, but inch by inch, the Thunderbolt responded, climbing out of danger with the slow, steady resolve of a machine built to endure. By the time the aircraft leveled out, the pilot's hands were trembling, his vision spotted at the edges, and his muscles ached from the physical strain of wrestling the jug at near transonic speeds. But he was alive. The bombers were safe. and the legend had begun. The sky fell quiet around him, filled only by the deep, steady thrum of the engine that had carried him through an act no one believed possible. What he had done would sound exaggerated in retelling. It would seem like bravado, the exaggeration of combat memory, until mechanics peeled open the aircraft and discovered the truth written in metal. And that truth, the aftermath of pushing a brute force machine beyond its design, would reshape how the Allied air forces understood the P-47 forever. When the Thunderbolt finally rolled onto the runway, its tires screeching against the steel matting of the airfield, the ground crew rushed toward it with a mix of routine urgency and unspoken concern. They had seen combat-worn jugs before, bullet holes punched clean through the fuselage, scorched panels from flak bursts, engines coughing smoke like dying beasts. But they had never seen a P-47 return from a dive like this one. The aircraft looked intact, but there were signs, small, subtle, unnerving, that it had been pushed to the very limits of its existence. The metal skin along the wings bore faint ripples, stress marks formed only under the crushing hand of extreme aerodynamic forces. Rivets near the tail had loosened from the vibration. The turbocharger ducts showed hairline distortions from heat and pressure beyond anything the manuals predicted. A veteran crew chief ran his palm along the left wing, feeling the faint tremor through the metal, the aircraft still shivering from the violence of the dive. Mechanics exchanged glances. None of them spoke the truth out loud, but it hung in the air like smoke. The pilot should not have survived that maneuver. The jug should not have survived that maneuver. Inside the debriefing room, the pilot sat across from intelligence officers who looked at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He described the encounter in precise, technical terms: the angle of the dive, the onset of compressibility, the sudden convergence with the Me-262. But beneath the words ran the pulse of something harder to articulate. The feeling of wrestling a machine past the point of fear, past the point of logic, into a territory where survival depended purely on instinct and nerve. The officers scribbled notes, their eyebrows tightening each time he mentioned the speeds he had reached. They asked him to repeat certain details, as if trying to find a flaw in the story, a miscalculation, an exaggeration. But his voice never wavered. Word of the event spread through the airfield like wildfire. Pilots huddled in tight groups around mess hall tables, leaning in to hear every detail. A Thunderbolt had chased off a Me-262. Not evaded, not merely survived. Chased. For men who lived inside the cockpit's narrow margin between courage and terror, this was more than a story. It was a recalibration of their world. The jug, long dismissed as a big fat brute, had shown it possessed a ferocity no one had expected. In the days that followed, tactics subtly shifted. Squadron leaders began to reconsider the Thunderbolt's role in jet encounters. Training officers emphasized controlled high-speed dives, pushing pilots to understand the fine line between using compressibility and falling victim to it. Briefings mentioned the event with cautious optimism, never promising that a P-47 could outmatch a jet consistently, but acknowledging that under the right circumstances, with altitude, momentum, and a fearless pilot, the impossible could be wrestled into reality. Meanwhile, on the German side, the encounter triggered a quieter, darker reflection. Me-262 pilots who once viewed American fighters as predictable adversaries began to carry a sliver of doubt. They had relied on speed as their shield, on acceleration as their authority. But speed was not absolute, and a machine like the Thunderbolt, designed with the brute force philosophy of American industry, could exploit physics in ways their sleek jet could not counter in a dive. The Luftwaffe's confidence, already battered by fuel shortages, leadership fractures, and overwhelming Allied numbers, cracked just a little more. For the pilot, the event did not become a trophy. It became a memory, one weighted with both pride and a quiet, lingering astonishment. In later years, when recounting the encounter, he often spoke less about the thrill of the chase and more about the silence that followed. That eerie, expansive stillness after he pulled out of the dive. The sudden absence of speed, noise, and chaos. A silence where he felt suspended between two truths. He had survived something he shouldn't have, and he had discovered something about his aircraft and himself that he never expected. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once underestimated, had proven its worth in the most unforgiving arena imaginable. It wasn't grace that carried it through that sky. It wasn't innovation or elegance. It was raw endurance, industrial strength, and a kind of stubborn, unyielding character that mirrored the men who flew it. The Jug was never meant to outrun jets, but on that day, in that dive, driven by a pilot who refused to accept the limits written on paper, it broke through a wall of impossibility and emerged on the other side as something legendary. In the end, history rarely preserves the moments that follow the explosions, the dogfights, the narrow escapes. But sometimes, it remembers a single impossible act. A machine pushed past its boundaries. A pilot pushed past his fears. A chase that should not have happened yet did. From the fire-stricken skies of Germany to the quiet hangars where the Jug awaited its next mission, the story became a whispered testament to the truth of warfare. Limits are not fixed. They are challenged. They are bent. And sometimes, under the right hands and in the right moment, they are shattered. And in that shattering, a legend is born.